Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you here for this event. I think people are still trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started to make sure we have a lot of time to get to a lot of different questions. So I want to start off by sending it over to acknowledging Noam, Hakeem, and Emily Gallo, who helped put this event together. And I'm going to pass it on to Noam to start us off, and then to move to Emily for some introductions.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for joining the Institute's event on comparative elections, where we will be comparing the recent elections in Greece, which underwent 4 elections, and then also viewing how that pertains to Israel's case, which is about to undergo its 4th election next week. So without further ado, Emily will help present the speakers.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Emily. I'm one of the undergraduate fellows here. Joining us today are Professors Roy Peled and Ioannis Grigoriadis. Professor Peled is the Koret Visiting Professor here at UC Berkeley, and he's going to be presenting Israel's case. And Professor Grigoriadis is the Associate Professor at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. He'll be presenting Greece's case. And then moderating this event is Noam, who, like me, is an undergraduate fellow here, and I will hand things back over to him, and we'll start. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. So now that we've done introductions, let's begin with both Professor Peled and Professor Grigoriadis providing a brief outline of the electoral system and struggles in their respective countries.
I should go first. So thanks, Noam and Emily, and thanks, Rebecca and Maya. Thinking of this event, I remembered something I was once told. Liz Taylor, they say, when she got married for the 8th time, said to the photographers and reporters in her wedding that she knows what she's expected to do, she just doesn't know how to do it interesting anymore. And that sort of reminds me about it's sort of how I feel about talking about Israeli elections these days. We're about to have the 4th election within 23 months, just shy of 2 years. And maybe it's best really to sort of run us through what happened in the past 23 months. Israel, took lots of pride in its electoral system. It was a highly proportional system, gave lots of representation for many different groups, religious, secular, Arab, different sects within the Arab sector were all represented in parliament. And it worked for 70 years. And also through a few times of crisis where leading parties from opposing sides came together to form governments in '66 and in 1984. But something deep changed in last few years. We had a government formed by Netanyahu in 2015 that lasted for 4 years, which is a long time in Israeli terms. We had early elections in 2019, 7 months before they were planned to take place. But for the first time in history, following those elections, the Knesset parties, the Knesset factions failed to create a government. So you need to have 61 members of the 120 in the Knesset support one candidate and the government he suggests to form. And what you had here is the right plus Orthodox parties supporting a Likud-led government by Netanyahu, the center-left opposing that, and suddenly Avigdor Lieberman, the leader of a clearly right-wing, some would say radical right-wing party, refusing to join a Netanyahu government-led party. Clearly, there's no really nice way to put it. This was clearly over deep personal hatred the two people have to each other. There is zero ideological conflicts between them. Lieberman put Netanyahu's corruption allegations as part of the discussion, but anybody that knows anything about Israeli politicians know Lieberman is no prime contestant for the Good Governance Award. And there was a stalemate, and there was no way to form a government for the first time of Israel's history. No candidate appointed by the president to form a government could have done so, and Israel went to a second cycle of election just 5 months later, September 2019. And same thing happened again. There was a raise of the threshold between the first and second election cycle, which was, going back to Lieberman, something he took pride in because he thought that would leave some Arab parties that traditionally, there were 4 different Arab parties that neither would have passed that threshold, but they came together to form one joint list and actually got the biggest representation Arab parties ever had in parliament in Israel. 13 out of the 120 seats were theirs. And again, no option to form a government. And the third election cycle, which took place in 2020, in I think it was March, yeah, just a year ago, March 2020, seemed to end in a very similar way, but people were exhausted and fed up, and the prospects of a fourth election seemed like quite alarming. And there you had a situation where the lead candidate of the center left, but a very centrist candidate, decided to accept Netanyahu as the prime minister. And it's important to say this deeply split the center left, because it was a very much, like the recent elections in the United States, it was very much yes or no Netanyahu vote. The center left voted no on Netanyahu. Netanyahu couldn't have formed a government without the center left. And the leader of the main center left party, Blue and White, Benny Gantz, decided to basically give up on completely replacing Netanyahu, and instead signed an agreement with Netanyahu to form a joint government in which Netanyahu will be prime minister for a year and a half and Gantz prime minister for the second, or for a following year and a half, agreeing in advance that the government will only exist for 3 years. So these two people deeply distrust each other, created a very complex agreement that generated lots of changes and some very fundamental stipulations in Israel's basic law government, just to sort of lock both of them inside this government. Nevertheless, like almost everyone told Gantz to begin with, Netanyahu didn't really plan to get to the point where he hands power over to Gantz, and used debates over the budget, which has to pass or the government falls, to bring upon a fourth election. Now, 2 things to mention in the background before I end this. First of all, of course, Netanyahu's trial, which has begun already, but has yet to enter its testimonies phase. And the second, which is very much related, is that at least for a decade now, there is very little real political ideological debates among 90% of the Knesset members. The factions from Likud all the way to Labor don't have any real deep disagreements, neither on Israeli-Palestinian relations peace process, nor on economical issues. Of course, they're not exactly the same, but that's not the issue. The only issue in Israeli politics now is Benjamin Netanyahu. That's the decisive factor. That's what people are going for elections on. The one thing I will say about the upcoming elections, more than any time in the past, all the parties except for one have aligned themselves along the line of Netanyahu or not. There is only one party, the right-wing Yamina party led by Bennett, that are saying we will join a Netanyahu government and we may also join a non-Netanyahu government. All the others have committed themselves in the strongest words possible to supporting or opposing Netanyahu. we'll see how that plays out next week.
Thank you, Professor Peled. That's really intriguing. Professor Grigoriadis, would you like to present your case briefly on Greece?
Thank you very much now for the invitation, and my thanks to the whole team for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I will try to bring forward Greece's case because Greece has experienced a high number of elections within a very short amount of time, twice in its recent history, once in 1989, and the second chance was a few years ago in 2012. I will focus more on 2012 because this is, I think, more interesting for you. It is linked to the Greek economic crisis, of course, and which is a part of Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. So you may remember that starting in the United States, the global financial crisis hit the Eurozone, and suddenly many of the assumptions were shaken about the ability of the Greek and other economies in the Eurozone to meet their debt obligations. What was interesting in the case of Greece was that while in other countries like Portugal or Italy or Ireland, the two parties, the biggest parties, the established political actors were able to come up with a compromise and come up with a joint plan to help the economy overcome the crisis. This was not the case in Greece. And I think that this is one of the interesting points if you look into a comparative study of political party systems. So the two Greek parties, the big Greek parties, the PASOK, which is the socialist, social democrat, and New Democracy, which is, let's say, the conservative, center-right, right-wing party, that have dominated the Greek political system since the 1970s, since the collapse of the military regime in Greece. They have been operating on an environment which can be called as a bipartisan system, a bipolar political party system. So two big actors and some small, but not really important. Single-party governments were the rule. And of course, the electoral law was quite helpful in that. So unlike in the case of Israel, the electoral law started from a proportional basis, but added some important privileges for the biggest part, particularly for the biggest party. So the first party would get a very handsome bonus of seats, and there would be a threshold around 3% that was introduced in the late 80s to prevent the entry of minority parties. So it was not really a measure to prevent the entry of far right-wing or far left-wing political parties. It was mainly a measure to prevent the emergence in the Greek parliament of an independent party of Greece's minority in Thrace. So what was the lesson out of this? Well, in 2009, when the situation about the future of the Greek economy becomes clear, the government decides to resign and call for early elections. So there is a single-party government by PASOK, under George Papandreou, that takes power, but faces a very hard reality because it fails to tell the truth from the beginning about how bitter and how difficult the situation is about the Greek economy, and fails to challenge the established views about what brought the country to that point. So as the two parties, PASOK and New Democracy, proved unable to tell some hard truths to the Greek public opinion, and they tried to put the blame for the predicament to the international community, to the European Union, and they tried to link the austerity measures that proved to be inevitable under the circumstances to the introduction of the measures. So in a sense, the causality was reversed. It was not the crisis that brought austerity, it was austerity that brought the crisis. Of course, following such an argument was not moving anywhere, the country. So sooner than later, the government had to face a very big pressure by the European authorities. And this allowed for a political crisis when the prime minister floated the idea of a referendum. And this met with a reaction by his own party in 2011. So he had to resign and bring a government of experts, so a coalition government that was meant to be a caretaker government, simply to sign the haircut agreement with Greece's creditors. So as soon as this happened in early 2012, the biggest party in the coalition, New Democracy, decided to bring this coalition to an end and call for early elections. And that was a very interesting moment because this was the election in May 2012, where the Greek political party system appeared as fragmented as ever. New Democracy fell to 18%. PASOK fell even more, which was the government, single-party government, right? Even the term PASOKification was introduced to talk about a party that disappears suddenly from the political spectrum. But the inability of the pro-memorandum, the pro-political economic reform parties to establish a government, they didn't have enough seats, led to a second election within 4 weeks. So there was an election in May and an election in June. So ironically, there were some MPs that served for only 1 day. So it was like a 24-hour parliament. And you may be surprised to see that there were people that tried to. There was a very infamous case of a vice president of the Greek parliament in that single day that tried to have his daughter hired by the Greek parliament within 24 hours. So you get this. And then in the second elections, you see a consolidation of the bigger parties. So New Democracy gets about 10%. Syriza, which was the party that emerged out of the crisis, increases sharply its percentages and emerges as the second important actor. And of course, some of the parties that emerged, these extremist parties that emerged in the May election, survived in the June election as well, most notably the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn and the far-right wing Independent Greeks Party. So what was interesting was that while the refusal of New Democracy to collaborate with PASOK with the reform project that the country had necessary, like it was necessary for the country, radicalized the right-wing voters that used to be voting for New Democracy. So when the party decided later to make a U-turn, they decided not to follow the party, but follow the extremist parties that continued along these lines. So this reflected, in my opinion, a very interesting transformation of the Greek political party system and the emergence of new fault lines within Greece. So it was not no more about right and left, so the role of the state in the economy or the role of religion in the public sphere, whether we should be more secular or more religious oriented. It was more about attitudes towards globalization, attitudes towards institutions like the European Union, fears about the future of the country, fears about migration and identity politics. So this became explicit in the elections of 2012, and it became even more explicit 3 years later, like in the elections of 2015, whereby Syriza was able to win the elections. So Syriza was able, that was an election, you can call it like it was the third leg of this election election group that took place 3 years later, but consolidated some trends. So in that respect, populism proved to be very victorious out of this right-wing and left-wing populism. And the government that Syriza decided to form in this year was a big surprise for many because Syriza did not decide to work with a center party, liberal party that could give some credibility to the government, especially in front of the international creditors, but chose to collaborate with a far right-wing populist party. So there were very strange bedfellows there, which of course makes us think about the nature of politics under crisis circumstances. And of course, This led Greece to the referendum that almost brought it on the brink of financial and political collapse. The country risked exiting from the European Union. As the result, in my opinion, the government hoped that the result would be not the one that it demanded from the people, but the opposite. But the people listened to the government and sort of voted against the austerity plan. So while the government decided to make a U-turn, this undermined the credibility of the populist promise. So I think that with the re-election of the democracy under a moderate and a more liberal political leader, like a year ago, like 2 years ago in 2019, Greece has entered a new phase in that respect, where we can call it the post-populist era. So in that respect, Greece may have entered this era first, but it may have exited first as well. So that's an interesting point to keep in mind for our discussion. So I'll stop here to give time for discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering if both of you can speak a little bit on the role of corruption in causing the electoral crises and how corruption has hindered also both countries' ability to get out of their crises.
You want to go to first this round, Ioannis?
So, well, corruption has been a very central, it's been a central theme, but it's very important in all populist discourses, because populist discourses try to personalize politics. And in that respect, they argue that like if you're a member of an elite, so you try to sort of manipulate your position in order to acquire illicit or illegitimate gains. Of course, what the situation is, in most cases, is that the lack of institutional depth and institutional capacity is what really promotes corruption. So just calling your opponents corrupt or inherently bad while we're inherently good doesn't go very far, especially when populist parties come to power in the end. So Syriza and the independent Greeks were organizing this rhetoric for years against the established political parties. And of course, the state of Greek economy was also due to the misperformance of these political parties for decades, right? But the problem was that these parties actually appeared to be repeating the worst of these established political parties. And when they came to power, this became quite clear. So in that respect, cases of corruption within the Syriza Anel independent Greek government became very clear. And this led to, let's say, the disenchantment of the Greek public opinion from this rhetoric and this sort of message. So at this moment, this is at a low point. So people understood that corruption is not linked to persons, but to institutions. And there are not good parties and bad parties, but the question is how the state can create transparent and sort of open to the public procedures which can make corruption less, like more difficult or impossible. So in that respect, that's a very important lesson to take, I think, from the Greek case.
I think it's playing out a little differently in Israel, although the insight on the nexus between corruption and populism is very clearly in play. So corruption in Israel in the last 5 years is a discussion around Netanyahu. And it turned so to be that you are not supportive or sincerely fighting against corruption, but you're fighting for or against Netanyahu, which made, and that translates to a question about rule of law and about the law enforcement institutions. So Netanyahu managed to turn this whole thing on its head in a way that this is not whether you support rule of law as a means to enforce, right, the law even on the most powerful people, as we normally think should be the case, and have equality before the law, but this is whether you support the corrupt elites trying to bring down the authentic representative of the middle lower class as embodied in Netanyahu, right? Himself a rather rich millionaire and son to one of the more elitist esteemed families in Jerusalem. But he managed to turn himself into the savior of what is coined now as Second Israel, and all the attempts to bring him to justice as another maneuver of the old elites trying to hold to power. So the Netanyahu campaign now, right, is anybody fighting me is fighting you. It's not because, you know, there's nothing real they have against me in legal terms, but they're after me because they're after you. They're after you, the average middle lower income Israeli. And as Ioannis mentioned earlier in the Greek case, this has created many strange bedfellows. Netanyahu, in his recent attempt to stay in power while getting rid of the center-left party of Benny Gantz, suddenly found support in the Islamist party led by Abbas Mansour, you know, which was the most furthest away from Likud and from Likud supporters. And you would think nobody could ever imagine the fundamentalist Islamists sitting in a government with the Likud, led by Likud. And, you know, suddenly Netanyahu, in a very clear, quick, swift, effective re-education of his followers, said, you know, we're not racist. Why? It's clear that we can find middle grounds with the Islamist party. And he is also campaigning now in the Arab sector for the first time, you know, seriously investing in campaigning in the Arab sector, thinking he can get, you know, maybe some of the votes needed to secure his perpetuated stronghold of government. So unfortunately, I have to say, it's not become, it's a huge factor in how things are rolling, but it's not a huge factor in the debate. Even the center-left parties that are opposing Netanyahu cannot really say that this is about corruption in general. Lieberman, I mentioned earlier, which they are all happy to collaborate with in order to bring down Netanyahu, does not have much less baggage than Netanyahu in terms of corruption. But it is about bringing Netanyahu down. And also, of course, on this side of the equation, there are strange bedfellows, right? So Labor and Gideon Sa'ar, which left Likud as an inner opposition to Netanyahu, are cooperating. The one thing I will say about next week, and I'll end this with that, is that everybody has set everything aside now and are not shy of these new partnerships. And it is clear that if a government will be formed, including Labor, let's say on the one end, maybe Meretz, which is left of Labor, and Bennett on the far right, they can't agree on a lot, and they won't have any platform to move forward on. The agreement will be, we need to cooperate for a limited time to just get rid of Netanyahu and move forward. And then we can start fighting back on other issues.
And for Professor Grigoriadis, in order to understand what maybe lies ahead for Israel, can you talk a little bit about how the repeated elections in Greece impacted public trust in the democratic system?
Well, 2012 was a period of deep distrust to democratic institutions within the Greek public opinion. And the fact that parties like the Golden Dawn, like neo-Nazi far right-wing parties and far left parties that were not favoring liberal democracy, and other left-wing, far right-wing parties were able to make it to the parliament, showed that there was some sort of disappointment against the system as a whole. So the fear was that this is we were expecting certain things from the political system. We're expecting a certain level of prosperity, a certain level of benefits, and to the extent that this is not happening, there was a sort of wholesale rejection of the political party system. But soon, and that was interesting, I think that Greece's membership of the European Union has created a sort of a centripetal force for the Greek political party system. And soon it became clear that for the country to overcome this crisis, some consolidation of the political forces was necessary. So as Greece had no experience of multi-party coalition governments, so that was only an exception, and the year I described was an exception in that respect. So the two parties, so the center left and the center right pole, started consolidating again. So right now we do have the center right political party like New Democracy representing the center right political pole. In the center left, there is an interesting discussion because Syriza has this origins that bring it to the far left, sort of let's say radical left, but they had to like moderate their position and their views in order to appeal to a greater voting body in the center left. So that was the initial objective of the party leader, Alexis Tsipras, and former prime minister. But it seems in recent cases, like in recent weeks and recent months, that it is not as easy for the party to get rid from its radical past. So, for example, there was some protests during the pandemic in Greece, again, on the rights of one of the convicted November 17 terrorists. About his prison terms, he wanted to apply for change in his prison, and this was appeared to be sort of against the regulations. So he started a hunger strike, and there was a big mobilization within the party in order to support him, and even organize demonstrations under pandemic conditions. So these appeared to be like favorable to the party leadership, but opinion polls showed that the center-left voters were not happy about this whole situation. So there may be a chance for another political party in the center-left to try to fill that gap. It's not a clear case. But a big difference I would like to highlight here, because on the basis of what Professor Peled mentioned, is that there is no charismatic figure like Netanyahu that everybody loves or hates right now. Maybe in the 80s, it was Andreas Papandreou, so it was the leader of PASOK in the 80s, that was able to generate this very strong feeling. So people will identify with him fully or would completely hate him. So he could sort of define to some degree the fault lines of the Greek political system. But this is not a time for charismatic figures in Greece, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. And to Professor Peled quickly, do you have any predictions about what will happen next week in the election? And how do you think that these questions will impact the result?
Yeah, this also goes to the question of trust you just mentioned, because one of the big unknowns of next week is the turnout. There is a fear among mostly center left that the despair and also the frustration with the fact that Benny Gantz, which I mentioned earlier, which committed to not joining Netanyahu in government before the third election, ended up sharing power with him, and was seen by many in the center left as betraying their main cause, which was getting rid of Netanyahu. That may lead people to stay at home on election day. The turnout actually for the third cycle was very impressive, and it was part of this real sense that something is happening. And you know, politics is about drama and about things happening, and a lot of people are getting the sense from 3 election cycles and now a 4th that it's worthless, that it doesn't generate any real change in their lives. So that is a main struggle. That is also extremely important because of the threshold, because we have now 4 parties, 1 on the far right and 3 on the center left, that are just, in the polls, they are just around the threshold. You need 3.25% to pass, and they are all between 3 and 3.5. And of course, that has a lot to do with the turnout. If there is a lower turnout on the allegedly frustrated center left, then these votes become diluted and their percentage lower. And if any of these parties doesn't pass, then the votes are spread evenly between all the other parties. So what you have now in polls as of yesterday evening is really a 50-50 chance of Netanyahu being overthrown. You have the Likud and the ultra-Orthodox parties in the low 50s. You have the center-left, or I wouldn't, actually not center-left, center-left plus the anti-Netanyahu right, just on 60, different polls between 59 and 61. And then you have, I said earlier, that one party that can go either way, the right-wing party that can go either way. One thing is very clear, and no one on the anti-Netanyahu camp, which again has right-wing, center, and left-wing parties, I think is going to join a Netanyahu government this time around because it'll be their political end. So we will know the minute we have the results, whether there is going to be a Netanyahu government or not. The results might take a day or two because of these uncertainties of who passes or who doesn't the threshold. There is one factor that wasn't in the play up to now. There could easily be a Likud government if Likud chose to get rid of Netanyahu. Likud is by and far the most popular party in Israel. Polls give them 30 mandates, 30 seats in Knesset, and the second runner-up, Yesh Atid, led by Lapid, have 18, 19. So Likud is clearly the most popular. The Likud agenda is the most popular. I mean, their satellite parties around them, together with them, have an absolute majority. So democratically, there should be a Likud-led government based on the Likud platform. And if there is a 60-61 seats against Netanyahu, Likud can retain power if they get rid of Netanyahu, appoint someone else and say, let's form a government led by us. It'll be an easy thing for them to do. Will there be people that are willing to stand up to Netanyahu and say it's time to go home and let us retain power is a big question to be seen. So far, there is no real opposition to him. The only one that was real opposition left Likud and created a new party, that's Gideon Sa'ar.
Thank you to both professors for your intriguing insight. So to begin Q&A, I will hand things over to Maya.